My voice, yeah, my voice isn't brilliant this morning, I'm afraid to say, but I'll do my best nevertheless to get on with things, and I'm sure that you know, I can get some voice support if if need be. But anyway, here we are. I was going to talk a little bit about asymmetries in speech articulation with a specific reference to English, where we've carried out a couple of projects in the past looking at asymmetries, particularly in tongue-palate contact. And, you know, at some point we found these to be rather significant, worth investigating. There's, in fact, very little research on it that has been done in the past. So we thought, let's explore this in a bit more detail. We took this relatively far up to, let's say, COVID, which interrupted the data collection in this particular project significantly. But anyway, I mean, nevertheless, possible to at least report some results here. And just against a general background and start whistling, I mean, I don't want to be patronizing in any way, but just generally quickly take us to a particular aspect of taxonomy, phonetic taxonomy, that we're tapping into, I would think. I mean, this model of speech production, I'm sure, is well known. Just highlighting that there are a couple of relevant aspects as a general background: neural control system, hemispheric specialization for language is important in that respect, obviously. Language center is in the left hemisphere, by far the largest number of people. Occasionally in the right hemisphere, lateralization is an important aspect that will be useful to remember as we go along. So at the neural level, planning of speech, optimization of those plans by the cerebellum. That's something we hinted at in a previous lecture. So Broca sets up a plan, as it were, that is sent to the contralateral part of the cerebellum. That cerebellum optimizes the plan, sends the plan back before execution. So the cerebellum, in fact, acts as an optimizer in many respects, and in that sense, you know, deserves probably more attention than it does. Okay, and then classic subdivision between initiation, phonation, and articulation. Initiation, initiating an airstream for the purpose that serves as the energy for speech. And we'll be talking a little bit about the direction of that airstream. Of course, different initiators that can be used, as you know very well. Airstream is then further modified by the process of phonation, particularly with respect to voicing distinctions, intonational prosodic distinctions, and voice quality specifically. And so that basically creates a buzzing, fundamental resonance that can be further modified by the process of articulation. And I always quite heavily associate myself with a John Lever, a taxonomical classification, where he makes a distinction between constriction type and location of that constriction. I mean, and underlying any taxonomical classification. So, you know, we'll be really focusing on this particular aspect in today's lecture. And then yeah, I'm not going to talk. I mean, we've spoken a little bit about perception and how perception can potentially be relevant in IF0, for example. And that was one of the points I made in the first lecture. And we did not really much talk about all kinds of feedback, yeah, perceptual feedback, but we didn't mention proprioceptive feedback in any way. That's essential too. Lever's taxonomy, you know, in a nutshell, looks like this, where he's got 3 classification principles of speech sounds. I've mentioned constriction type. I've mentioned location of the constriction, but what I think is still at the moment particularly innovative is a dimension of aspect of articulation. And in that sense, I would think that Lever's taxonomy is significantly different from other taxonomies, such as the IPA classification. And nothing new really about constriction type, where you've got a standard classification in terms of different degrees of opening in the constriction of the articulatory channel, complete closure, close approximation, and open approximation, giving rise to stops, fricatives, and resonance in Lever's classification. And his idea is really that you know, these 3 classes of sounds make up you know, the fundamental basis of the sound inventory in any language of the world. And that's sort of a bit the strong prediction of this taxonomy that you'll find in any sound inventory, typically stops, fricatives, and resonance. While looking at this, for example, in a database like Foible, which is very useful to investigate sound frequencies in languages of the world. I mean, yeah, I mean, that bears out, of course, for stops. That bears out for resonance, but, you know, not so much for fricatives. Fricatives, you know, is a sound class that is completely absent in some languages, and in that sense can be revealing. Just to give you an example of that, Aboriginal languages in Australia, there are about sort of 260, if I remember well. Of those languages, there are only a handful that actually do have fricatives. So, you know, let's say, I think only 2 or 3 do have fricatives, the others don't. And I find that an interesting observation because it really stands out in the world as a group of languages where fricatives are absent. And there's debate why that could be the case, but interesting. Hearing impairment is extremely prevalent in those societies, is at least the hypothesis, has been for many centuries, apparently, relying on historical sources. So, you know, most of these speakers can't actually hear the fricatives, so haven't really developed them in their languages. But anyway, that's a completely different story that I'm not going to go into any further. Okay, so constriction type. If we look at a few of those constriction types, and I'm just doing that because I'm pretty proud of the videos, actually. At complete closure, this is what you get. So sides of the tongue, tip of the tongue, make full obstruction, block the airstream, interrupts the airstream, pressure builds up, classic stop. Lever uses the term stop rather than plosive because he tries to look at things from an articulatory perspective. Whereas, you know, there's no or little interruption, in fact, in the fricatives. Okay. So constriction location, of course, is that anterior, posterior in the vocal tract. Not much new here, in fact, but that dimension of aspect of articulation is in fact quite innovative, was innovative at least in the 1990s when he published his book, Principles of Phonetics, where in fact he distinguishes a couple of phonetic dimensions that are actually cross-cut those other dimensions. And a good example, for example, is the conformational aspect, which basically refers to oral, I mean, the way the airflow flows through the articulatory channel and leaves the mouth, for example. An oral nasal distinction is relevant in that particular respect, or central lateral contrast in speech sounds. But I think what is interesting is that this aspect can in principle be combined with any of those other categories, and so that it predicts that you've got oral stops and nasal stops, and that you've got, for example, central fricatives versus lateral fricatives. And by setting up that kind of taxonomy, what I think he does rather nicely is that this taxonomy emphasizes similarities between speech sounds, whereas the IPA has a very different goal, identifying perceptual differences between speech sounds, so that, you know, in an IPA perspective, a stop nasal distinction, two entirely different categories. So very different in many respects. Whereas in the Lever perspective, you've got an oral stop B and a nasal stop M that in fact are identical in very many ways, except in that conformational, in that oral nasal distinction. And I think that is particularly nice also from a taxonomical perspective, because it looks like if you look at languages of the world, the way sound systems are organized, it always strikes me, I haven't done any calculations there, but it always strikes me that if you've got a set of oral stops, the nasal stops, in fact, pattern similarly in a phonological perspective, and you get these nice asymmetries between those two classes, which could sort of are suggestive of the relevance of that conformational distinction. Right. Here, the topographical distinction, that's really what we are looking at here today. Topographical differences relate to the overall shape of the tongue, whether you know, the tongue is convex overall, concave overall, relates to also lateral. So basically longitudinal, you look at this in a longitudinal perspective, but also in a lateral perspective, you know, is the tongue grooved or not, for example, that is actually an aspect of topography. It hasn't been developed very well in Lever's perspective. I think definitely needs more reflection. But the asymmetries that we'll be talking about really relate to this, in the sense that we're looking at the lateral topographical aspect, in fact, here. Okay, so just to give you that general background, that is what we are dealing with today in a more general phonetic framework. So I don't need to say anything about places of articulation. I mean, you are intimately familiar with those. But what I just wanted to point out is that, of course, the lingual articulations, in fact, form the bulk, is the active articulator in the bulk of speech sounds in languages of the world. I've had a quick look at foible again here, and so all the lingual, where the tongue is the active articulator, all those sounds make up about 50% of all the sounds in the world's languages, which is quite significant, I would say. So yeah, that's sort of what we are focusing on here. This doesn't have anything to do with the lecture, but let me just, if you want to see or use for teaching purposes some of those videos that we've made a long time ago, but that I've made available on my website, feel free to do that. So get in touch if you want to have some of the videos. That's definitely not a problem. I do apologize for the pompous extension, phonetics.expert, but that happened to be the cheapest extension at the time. So I thought, yeah, let me, in fact, use that then. But the website's got, in fact, a survey of all the consonants and vowels, and it gives you or students the symbols for all the stops here in this particular case, with basic labels, but also other types of information. So if you now want to listen to a voiced velar plosive, then that voiced velar plosive can be accessed, can be listened to. Agga, agga, agga. It tells you, you know, it's in the top 100 of speech sounds in languages of the world, so it's very frequent. And in fact, you can check how frequent is it. It occurs in 58% of all the foible languages. And I can never remember how many languages there are in foible. Is it something like 2,300 something inventories? So it gives you, I think, and it gives students particularly an excellent idea of how frequent certain speech sounds are. And at the bottom, you'll find those videos illustrating the articulation of some, not all of them, but in any case, some of those articulations, like the velar one. So, which can be particularly useful, I think, for students or quick access to some basic information, in fact. And it enables also students to listen contrastively to particular distinctions, which may be particularly relevant in ear training and transcription contexts. So let me not hijack my time here too long, but useful probably also to point out that there are many passages of the North Wind and the Sun that are not so easily accessible, but in this particular case, and it's work in progress still, but I have about 50, 60 different of those that were recorded at Edinburgh University in the 1950s and 1960s. They've now been made available also via other routes, but you know, they can be accessed here For example, David Abercrombie's reading.
The north wind and the sun were disputing which was the stronger when a traveller came along wrapped in a warm cloak. They agreed that the one who first succeeded in making the traveller take his cloak off should be considered stronger than the other.
Hyper RP articulated, which is nice to listen to. So that can also be very useful. And there's one very confusing one. I don't have it on the site here, but it's the Maidu, which is a Californian Indian language that has died out. And I thought I was so lucky to have the last reading in that language, but it was actually a transcription read by a phonetician specialist to show ejectives, implosives, and what have you. So it was a bit of a disappointment, but an interesting conclusion that these recordings find their way in amongst what native speakers have done. Yeah. And there's also an ear trainer in it, and I'm not sure whether I can now easily access that, but just to show you, also particularly useful for students, where students can, actually drill particular, they hear a speech sound, and they have to indicate, what do you hear? What plosive does that syllable now contain, just to direct their attention. And in fact, going at some point to relatively still guided transcription, but nonsense words where students do the transcription and in fact get feedback on the spot on how well they are doing. And the longer they use it, the more information they will get about their ability to do transcriptions. So they get feedback, with respect to certain dimensions that they may still find problematic. Anyway, so I do apologize for the little digression here, but you might find it useful. Okay, so really about the tongue as an active articulator. Historically, I think one of the extremely frequent and common techniques to investigate the involvement of the tongue in articulation is palatography. I say historically, yeah, you probably know about palatography. Typical distinction: static palatography versus dynamic palatography. And people nowadays often forget about static palatography, but it can nevertheless be a very useful technique to quickly visualize a particular place of articulation in difficult circumstances. For example, far out in the field, you don't always have sufficient support to do things in a more controlled way. Static palatography involves a dye, a coloring, well, what is it? In this particular case, charcoal and oil. The tongue is painted. You'll see that a bit better here on this. Now the tongue gets painted using this dye. The speaker articulates an individual speech sound or a word that is designed in such a way that the sound of interest is not confounded with the others. Like a word, if you're interested in a fricative, the word some is actually a very nice one because the is a fairly open vowel. The does not involve the tongue in any way, so that in fact the fricative appears rather well on any in the articulation. So the speaker articulates, the dye rubs off on the palate where the tongue touches the palate. A mirror is used and inserted into the mouth just after articulation. And in fact, the palate reflects, you don't see that very well here at least, but the palate reflects in the mirror so that you can make a photograph of it and have a record of, where the tongue actually touched the palate. I mean, a sophisticated dental mirror is very expensive to use, but even in a class, phonetics class, using a little makeup mirror, in fact, does a miracle really nicely. In this particular case, visualizes an alveolar plosive such, or in the field, particularly useful sometimes in a paper that we published on Lusoga, which is a language spoken in Uganda, which has a dental alveolar phonemic distinction, which is very unusual. In fact, in quantitative terms, I mean, it's not difficult to see, I think, that in the dental articulation, there is a lot of rub-off on the upper teeth and essentially nothing on the alveolar ridge, whereas in the alveolar articulation, there is dye on the alveolar ridge and nothing on the upper teeth. So in those contexts where, you want to quickly access information about articulation, place of articulation specifically, this can still be a rather useful technique in many ways. But too many restrictions if you want to set up a more controlled data collection. I mean, it's difficult to quantify this type of, so how extensive is the actual tongue-palate contact? It's not so easy. You can get around it, but not so easy to standardize this suitably. And obviously the most important disadvantage is that it is static. It does not provide any dynamic information, so you cannot really record short phrases, words, phrases, utterances without compromising the results really. So we've been using electropalatography quite a bit. And what happens in electropalatography, basically same principle. You want to get information about tongue-palate contact. It's not so informative about tongue dynamics, can be, but not primarily. And what happens, a stone cast is made, an impression is made of a speaker's palate and upper teeth, and on that individual stone cast, in fact, an artificial acrylic palate is modeled that fits that individual speaker. The acrylic palate has rows of silver electrodes embedded in it, and each electrode is in fact connected by means of a copper wire. The wires sort of collect at the back, and so this is the front of the speaker. That's the posterior part of the vocal tract, and in fact these wires leave the mouth in the corners of the mouth. In fact, not much interference with articulation, because that could be an objection against using the technique. And also the thickness of the palate may be problematic. And I have to admit that some technicians are excellent at this. and do really thin acrylic palettes, and others do not manage that so well. And of course, you get interference with articulation to some extent. And people do not seem to be consistent either, technicians that we've used in the past. I mean, I can just imagine that this is a complicated thing to do. So it's not a critical note, in fact. Well, the number of electrodes differs a bit on the arrangement of the electrodes, can differ depending on the make and depending on the aim, the objective of the actual experiment or data collection. But the one that you see here is actually a version of the Reading system that has how many, 8 rows or so? No, probably a bit more, but 62 electrodes in any case, which, is sort of a typical number of electrodes in the arrangement. In fact, here you see much better how many rows. Let me quick. 8 rows, in fact, just to make sure. And in fact, these electrodes, they are relates a bit asymmetrically to the picture that pops up on the computer screen. So it's the front 4 rows, about half, exactly half, in fact, projects onto the upper half of a palatogram. So that's alveolar and post-alveolar, a place of articulation. So, and the rest of the palate, so palatal and, with a bit of luck, velar as well, will project to the lower half of the palatogram. So it's maybe useful to remember that asymmetry. And in fact, each time during the articulation, the tongue touches an electrode, it will actually light up and appear, in this particular case, as a black square on the palatogram. Convention is that the anterior part of the palate points upward, is the upper part, the posterior is the lower part. So here, prototypical example of a alveolar stop, alveolar plosive. So neat contact between the sides of the tongue and the palate, as well as in the alveolar area. Not so much post-alveolar, really alveolar in this particular case. Nice indication of tongue bracing, in fact, where the sides of the tongue are in touch, in fact, with the palate to provide support for the articulation. In fact, also here in the velar situation, that's a little bit the case. Still evidence for that tongue-palate contact in a bracing context. And here you've got a almost prototypical example of an alveolar fricative with at least a little gap through which the air can escape with turbulence. That's the idea of a fricative. And I think, at least in this particular palatogram and in this particular palatogram, I think it's not difficult to see that they are asymmetrical. So there is a little bit more contact in this particular case on the left hand side of the palate. Is that true what I'm saying? Yeah. And in this particular case also slightly more contact on the left hand side. And so this is not influenced by radiographic or radiological assumptions that left is right and right is left. So this is left-right orientation, which is important because that does not always seem so clear from papers. Just to give you a little bit of an idea, I mean, not only used for research purposes, this technique, but also very often used in the UK, I'm aware, in a clinical context where, you know, this can be extremely useful in providing visual feedback, motor speech disorders, but I am particularly enthusiastic, in fact, about a hearing impairment, so that those speakers get visual feedback in order to improve their intelligibility. And just, you know, it gives you a bit of an idea of what a typical sort of data collection exercise could look like.
So we had a palette made for Lily. Lily would have had an impression of her upper teeth made like this. This then gets sent off to the technician who constructs one of these EPG palettes. On the palette, there are 62 silver electrodes. So each silver electrode is connected to a small copper wire, which is channeled out through the palette and into this comb. The comb fits into a multiplexer, which is worn round the individual client's neck, and that connects the child or adult to the computer so that they can then visualize where their tongue is touching on the roof of the mouth on the computer screen. On the computer screen, we can see exactly where the tongue is touching the roof of the mouth, and we can compare that to patterns that we know are accurate for speech sounds. So we can use it in the assessment of somebody's speech and diagnosis, but we can also use it for therapy. And for that, we are able to put up a stored pattern which shows what it is that this person should be achieving, and then they can try and copy that pattern.
And that seems to in fact, provide excellent results in dealing with hearing impairment and intelligibility. Here's a set of you know, the two sets of palatograms. The static and then the dynamic. I've taken exceptionally, because you don't find them so often, palatograms of the vowels in Dutch, in fact. And you notice, so you've got here the front vowels and the back vowels, like oo, o, what do we have in Dutch as well? Oh and ah, the back vowels, where there is in fact extremely little contact between the tongue and the palate, just maybe a little bit of a hint in the velar region. But in the front vowels, however, there can be quite significant contact, and, you know, going from closed vowels here, or high vowels, to low vowels, you know, it's pretty noticeable that that degree makes articulatory sense, really. But I think what stands out from this collection is that all these articulations are asymmetrical, all of them. And so in that, is it an, this is probably an U vowel, and so there's more contact on the right in this speaker. So this is all the same speaker, more contact on the right, here as well, there as well. And I'm sorry now, ignoring my listeners on Zoom, but in fact, more contact here on the right. That applies to this one as well, that one as well. And in fact, not difficult to see. I think, you know, that agrees rather well with the static palatograms that were made on the Dutch vowels in the 1930s, in fact. Again, asymmetry, not so easy to quantify, but easier to quantify on the EPG, the palatograms, in fact, just by calculating an index of laterality, essentially. So that is what struck us at some point. I said the dynamics are interesting in EPG. So this is a Dutch recording of the North Wind and the Sun. And I always find it amazing to watch.
De noordenwind en de zon waren erover aan het redetwisten wie de sterkste was van hun beiden.
So the dynamics are well reflected. But I'm going to try, I said on an earlier occasion that primarily this technique provides information about the contact patterns, not about the dynamics of the tongue, but
de noordenwind en de zon.
If you look at it, of course, you know, it turns out that if you go through the signal, that sometimes you notice that the tongue touches the left side, like here, of the palate first, and then that contact, I mean, if I had a higher sampling rate, you could actually see how that contact develops during the articulation of the speech sound. And in that sense, you know, the relationship between frames and the timing features may also provide information, in fact, about tongue dynamics. And that's something we hope to look at in the future. Okay, so that was the starting point. It struck us, you know, there seems to be asymmetry around in tongue-palate contact. How extensive is it? Can we find patterns in those asymmetries? Do people share similarities there? And looking at the literature, there's actually very little work done in the past. I think the standard paper is the Hamlet et al. Paper in Journal of the Acoustical Society of America, where they investigated 5 speakers of American English with a half palate, in fact. So with 32 or so electrodes in the alveolar and post-alveolar region, and those speakers were required to read short utterances, short phrases with either S in it and the alveolar fricative as an experimental sound, or with, in this particular case, L in it as an experimental sound. In fact, it looks like it's actually a research note that appeared. It looks like it's a partial report on the data collection because they only report what happened in those 4 utterances, and they had more utterances, in fact. You know, I don't know what has played a role there. So they had these speakers, so 5 speakers of American English read those utterances 5 times, and they looked at the tongue-palate contact patterns in those speakers. In fact, they did 2 things. They looked at spatial asymmetry, and they looked at temporal asymmetry. And they defined spatial asymmetry really as, you know, looking at the pattern in the point of maximal constriction. And that's spatial. Whereas temporal, they comment on occasions, is actually the asymmetry that arises in the transition between speech sounds. And that's what you've just seen, in fact, on that North Wind and the Sun recording, and that the tongue first makes contact with the left side of the palate. I don't know whether I can replicate that now. Would be ever so.
De noordenwind en de...
So, also typical, of course.
De noordenwind en de zon.
So that, you see that here, in this particular case, that there is more contact on the right that develops in that sound. That comes first and that comes second. So that is in that transition, an asymmetrical transition, and that is what is meant by temporal asymmetry, in fact. But what are the results? I mean, here are cumulative palatograms for those 5 articulations in each speaker. And how to read this, the full dots represent electrodes that were contacted each time during those 5 repetitions. The open circles, those electrodes were not always contacted consistently. So this is sort of a measure of consistency. And what else? They had timing information as well on each of the actual consistent realizations. So here they did not provide timing information because these contacts were not consistent, but they do have timing information here. That can be interesting to actually see that particular configurations were maintained longer than other configurations. I hope I'm right in saying I can't read the values very well, but I think here the durations were longer overall than on the right-hand side. So it means that, you know, there's more in terms of temporal asymmetry towards the left in this particular case. But I think you know, a couple of things that are striking. The extent of tongue-palate contact differs between individuals a little bit. Some people have more extensive contact, like this speaker. Let me do this. This particular speaker and also that one. Whereas in this particular case, the overall contact pattern is less extensive. So there's quite a bit of variability there. And I think it's also quite noticeable that in terms of the asymmetry, this particular speaker has more contact on the left of the palate. Here, there's somewhat more extensive contact on the right of the palate. And again, in this speaker, more contact on the left and more contact on the left. And so a bit of variability. Most speakers have more extensive contact on the left-hand side of the palate, occasionally more to the right-hand side, but that seems maybe a bit more exceptional were we to have more speakers potentially. So that was an interesting starting point, I think, that paper, and that has given rise to a few other investigations. What could be the cause for those asymmetries? I don't think it is difficult to imagine that a popular explanation could be handedness. Do these asymmetries go hand in hand with handedness? Hypothesis could be right-handers have more extensive contact on the right, left-handers have more extensive contact on the left. That's sort of the underlying idea. The data you've just seen does not seem to suggest that, because, well, there's more contact on the left. We don't know anything about the handedness of those participants, but typically there are many more right-handers than left-handers. So that goes a little bit against that hypothesis. also recognized by Hamlet. And in fact, she decided to look at this in quite a bit of detail in an early Journal of Phonetics paper of the 1980s. I was in 1987, I think, where she tried to determine those asymmetries in a large sample of participants. So what did she do? She investigated the articulation of L and of S in 300 and let me just quickly look, 357 participants, university students, sorry. Well, what did she do? She asked those students to report on the articulation of L. And L, well, what was the task? Students had to occupy the articulatory position for L. How would you normally say L? And, you know, all phoneticians, so they were used to occupying an articulatory position. And then simply breathe in, right? And you would feel where there's, you know, the colder side will provide an indication of whether, if L is asymmetrical, and you breathe in, the colder side would be indicative of where there's no contact between the side of the tongue and the cheek. And when you don't feel anything, you would probably conclude it's a symmetrical one. What would be yours?
Left hand. Feeling contact.
Left. So left hand and left. So you're consistent in that sense. If I do this.
But I have PPG data, I know that right shifted.
Okay, all right, yeah. And I'm variable, I have to say. I mean, when I tried this now, a couple of days ago, I had a strong right-handed asymmetry, and doing it now, I have a symmetrical articulation, in fact. Anyway, the fricative was tested by using a straw. And so she asked students to actually say the fricative, use a straw, keep it in front of the lower teeth. It says at a 30-degree downward pointing angle. And in fact, you can move the straw side to side. And where there is the strongest airflow, that would create the strongest resonance, in fact. So I'll demonstrate that. So if I do, yeah, okay. So, and so indeed, positioning the straw differently. And in my case, I would imagine I have a symmetrical articulation here. So, more symmetrical than, on either side. I don't know how big, wide the straw needs to be. I was lucky to find a rather big one. I would give it to you, but I have a cold, so I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that. But that was basically the task. Sort of a very basic set of tasks that are supposed to give information about either symmetrical articulation or right or left asymmetrical articulation. And it's important to note students worked on their own. They, I think, they, you know, the experimenter was not there. They had to fill out a questionnaire. They also had to fill out a questionnaire stating their handedness. You know, there are obviously various degrees of right and left-handedness. So that was not formally tested in any way. And if you look at the results, let me just make sure that they are clear. What in fact seems to be the case, that in both speech sounds, so you've got right-handers, left-handers, and ambidextrous, and it gives you, you know, the percentage of left-sided articulation, symmetrical articulation, and right-handed articulation. And in fact, it is pretty clear that the majority of articulations in the fricative are symmetrical, just like what I just demonstrated. A bit more, no, less, more right-handed than left-handed asymmetry. You know, and you know, that could be informative potentially, but also in L, you know, a lot of symmetrical articulations, in fact. And symmetrical here means that the tip of the tongue touches the alveolar ridge and there's no contact on either side of the tongue, so that the air actually flows round the obstacle in both senses. So here, you know, that's really, you could say, you know, the main finding is really, you know, there is a lot of symmetry, in fact, rather than asymmetry. And, you know, a very poor, if any, relationship between handedness and the location of the asymmetry, as a matter of fact. Now, obviously, we have to be a bit careful with those results. I mean, it's easy to criticize, but what I find a bit disturbing is that students were doing this on their own and without any control and double checks of, you know, are they serious? Are they doing a good job? You know, are they applying the techniques correctly and so on? So that has to be taken into account, I think. Another obvious explanation is potentially, you know, are asymmetries in the contours of the palate. That also pretty stands out really as an interpretation. Probably not so much asymmetries, we thought, in the actual contour of the speaker, but rather in the contour of the artificial palate. Does that artificial palate, is that symmetrical enough, even when clipped in, so that obviously if there are asymmetries in that design, if one side of the palate protrudes lower into the oral cavity, so in the articulation, it may well be the case that the tongue presses more strongly against that area or touches that area first, so that you get asymmetrical articulation. That's something we thought, yeah, that needs some investigation. And so in the process of collecting EPG data, what we've done is also scanned the palates. And so we had, of course, the stone cast for each individual speaker, the actual artificial palate that we clipped onto the stone cast, in fact, put in a cone beam CT scanner. There's that dental scanner that is really, you know, can focus on smaller objects, scanning smaller objects. So basically, it comes out with a detailed scan of the cast and the palate and the electrodes. And then a colleague of mine, who's a specialist in biomedical imaging, in fact, was able to disentangle those scans into different aspects of the artificial palate. So the actual palate of the speaker, of the stone cast, the wiring that was in there, but also the actual location of each individual electrode in a three-dimensional plane. And what we were sort of hoping to do, and that's when I said, yeah, COVID threw a spanner in the works. What we were sort of hoping to do was to use that information to decide how symmetrical, asymmetrical are these individual electrodes on either side, so that we could use that information potentially in the future to compensate, to normalize for, how shall I say, can I say, errors in the design, as it were, that may confound the findings. So that the asymmetries that we'd observe in the end are actually real asymmetries that do not originate from design issues or differences in the palettes. So for this individual speaker, so then it basically what was done was that corresponding electrodes were projected onto each other, so that eventually you can actually really nicely see how different they are in that three-dimensional plane. And for example, at that electrode 4 and 6, those are the corresponding ones. So that one is projected on that one, and that one onto that one. I mean, of course, in both cases, you get, in this case, a little bit of a difference that is mainly related to lateral position, but not so much here to the third dimension, the height dimension. And overall, and we, it should be able to easily quantify this. In this particular case, in 23, that corresponds to 22. There is a little bit of a difference in that third dimension, in fact. And it would be ever so nice to be able to use that information to normalize then for the real EPG recordings that we would be doing. And also for clinical purposes, I think that could be quite essential, because obviously if now speakers look at palatograms that are asymmetrical and try to imitate those asymmetries, that may just complicate matters needlessly if they are not meaningful in any way. So that's as far as we got with this particular project. But I still feel that it might be useful to pursue that issue. I mean, we have palatograms, palettes, acrylic palettes, stone casts of 20 speakers. We have recordings of 20 speakers. Some of those have been processed. I'll comment a bit on those later on, but still a lot of work, useful work can be done with those. Okay, that was also a bit of an aside. Now, going back to those asymmetries and the literature that is available, another project that was done in the wake, again, of the Hamlet investigation was an international project. between looking at English, looking at Italian, and looking at French. So 7 speakers in total, apparently, 3 Italian, 2 French, and 2 English native speakers. So they read the same, I mean, is my conclusion. Only the Italian data have been reported in a bit of detail. The 2 other sets have, I mean, I'm not aware of an extensive report on that. But the conclusion in a JASA summary is that all speakers, in fact, demonstrated asymmetrical lingual contact. All of them, all 7. You know, that did not differ in any way between the languages. They found apparently that alveolars are in fact most asymmetrical, more asymmetrical than velar speech sounds, and stops, in fact, are most asymmetrical in the articulatory release phase, not, in fact, in the middle phase, or the point of maximal constriction. I mean, more detail is given in an investigation by Farnetani in '88 on Italian. So she actually reports on those 3 Italian speakers and says, in fact, what they all had to do, also the French and also the English speakers, in fact, repeat nonsense words of this particular form, ata, iti, ati, ita. And so the phonetic context is varied in terms of vowel height, frontness, backness to a certain extent, but also clusters involving L were used. And she, in fact, also shows some of the palatograms here. And again, I think it's quite obvious that they are asymmetrical. You know, the build-up here is more like towards the left here, left, 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 and that persists quite significantly throughout all the palatograms, in fact. So, you know, it looks like also here there is a lot of left-sided asymmetry. And what they did was, in order to quantify that specifically, and that's done quite conventionally, use a Marshall Especer index of asymmetry, which is very simple. The number of electrodes on the right that were touched, that light up, minus the number of electrodes on the left, divided, in fact, by the total number of electrodes that were touched, in fact. And it gives you either a fraction or a percentage, depending how you deal with it. But negative values have more contact on the left, positive values, more contact on the right. I haven't really said this explicitly, but obviously I think it's pretty important to keep in mind that depending on where the bigger contact is, you know, the direction of the airflow, and that has a differential effect on the airflow. And so more contact on the left means that the airflow is directed towards the right and vice versa. And I thought maybe that may be the more relevant parameter in some sense. Anyway, I'll leave this way a little bit. But again, if you look at the individual indices of asymmetry, in fact, you notice differences between those 3 individuals. And so those are values for the different speech sounds in different contexts. But it's quite noticeable, I think, that in, so this is total amount of asymmetry. This reflects the index of asymmetry, meaning that, noticing this here, oops. So meaning that in this speaker, overall asymmetry is more towards the left, because the sign is mostly negative, a little bit towards the right, but just a fraction. And also in this particular speaker, however, asymmetry, so more extensive contact on the right. In the positive sign, just the one instance where that is not the case. And in the last speaker, there is really very consistent lateral asymmetry towards the left, and in fact, very large asymmetry as compared to the other speakers. So again, that indicates there's a variability, both in size as in direction. Yeah. Okay, those studies are really somewhat informative. They give an idea. I thought at some point, might be useful just to go and have a look in the literature. What do you find if I collect now a large data set of palatograms that have been published on a wide variety of languages, different speakers, different techniques probably as well. Do we find any consistency there? And does that provide us with an informative picture? So we basically went into the literature, tried to find as many articles on EPG as possible, articles that do have or did have pictures of palatograms that we can use to actually quantify things. So, and then prime targets are Journal of the International Phonetic Association, but also JASA, Clinical Linguistics and Phonetics, Phonetics, Language and Speech. Those were the ones that we consulted, and we collected palatograms of adults, not children, of typical speech, not atypical speech, and native speakers. Those were the inclusion criteria, and we just collected or made a picture of the palatogram and collected information about the number of electrodes in the specific system, but also information about the speakers, gender, age, if that was available. And I still find it remarkable that you just cannot find information about handedness in studies on typical speech, which should be reported really. So in total, we had 1,500 palatograms, give or take two, representing 11 languages: Spanish, English, Japanese, Croatian, French. 5 varieties of English were included, and how many speakers? 225 speakers, which is a quite substantial number, a roughly 50-50% division between male and female speakers, really. 5 varieties of English, 3 varieties of Spanish, and 2 varieties of Catalan that pop up, and people who know about EPG will be able to identify the authors, no doubt. But here we are, that's what we did. And for each palatogram, calculated that index of asymmetry. And well, will you be surprised to see that most of those palatograms are in fact asymmetrical. Yeah? A little rounding error here in the figures, but it is 83% of all those palatograms were in fact found to be asymmetrical. Somewhat bigger. And in fact, most of the asymmetries were towards the left. And so there were significantly more left-sided asymmetries than right-sided. So there was more contact on the left generally in speakers. So that's we did some statistics on this in terms of gender, voice, place, and manner of articulation. And we did find a significant difference both in terms of manner and place of articulation if you look at the data, were to look at the data in that particular respect. So visualizing this, here you are. So I've got the different categories here, sound categories, plosives to lateral approximants, and percentage left-sided and right-sided asymmetry. That's what you see here. And overall, I concluded, but in fact, a strong lateral asymmetry of lateral approximants. I mean, that's obviously not so surprising, really, in that obviously unilateral articulations of approximants, apparent lateral approximants, very common, apparently, 51% in Hamlet's data we found. So, that explains that strong contrast here, that strong effect of laterality, but more towards the left. And that applies to approximants, not so much to fricatives, where there's a bit more right-sided asymmetry, but taps, trills that were found in the data, nasals a 50-50%, but plosives a bit more right-sided. So the picture is probably not so clear as that overall picture and that overall claim that there is more left-sided asymmetry. And looking at this in terms of place of articulation, in fact, the suggestion is that, again, there is a stronger effect, that's a stronger effect in alveolars than in and in velars, in fact. And so that those are the two most asymmetrical ones, whereas in all the others, there is a smaller effect as such. So that's what you find in the data. In terms of that, was in terms of the direction of the asymmetry. I mean, I hope I said that initially. In terms of the degree of the asymmetry, how big are these asymmetries now, really? A statistical analysis indicates that the fricatives in these data are more asymmetrical than all the other sounds, in fact. So there's a bigger asymmetry there. In the analysis, if you compare fricatives to all the other sound classes, in fact, that most often comes out, not always, but comes out significant, in fact. Nasals generally don't seem to play a strong role there for some reason or another. So I think it's safe to conclude on the basis of these data that most of the articulations are asymmetrical. 83% of them. That's generally consistent with those studies that we've looked at. Overall, somewhat more contact on the left-hand side for all the speech sounds, except for fricatives, except for plosives. And so the airflow is generally directed towards the right overall, if you look at it in those terms. And fricatives are more asymmetrical than the other speech sounds. And does that, why could that be the case? Maybe deviating the airflow from its midline to either the left or the right hand side adds to the turbulence of the fricative. Maybe that is a useful tool in generating extra turbulence for fricatives. And it is quite striking if you look at individual palatograms of fricatives, that indeed it's very often the case that you get that pattern in fricatives. Okay, do I still have time? A little bit of, obviously in a study like this, it's informative, but there's a lot of variability in the setup and the speakers, in the languages, in obviously the sound inventory of those languages, with some languages having anterior fricatives as well as posterior fricatives, whereas that's not the case in English, for example. So we thought, nah, we can do better than that. And had this idea, let's collect EPG data, electropalatography data on British English, and see whether, to what extent we can find evidence for those asymmetries, basically in a far more controlled experimental setup. That was the idea. So in fact, we used initially some data that were available on the website of the Centre for Speech Technology Research in Edinburgh, which is referred to as the Mocha-Tinet database that contains not only EPG, but also EMA data on I think about 6 speakers that have been documented well. And the main collection consists of readings of 460 utterances that, in fact, looking at it very carefully, were designed in the 1980s in the United States at MIT, basically for the purpose of training speech recognition systems. Things like Jane may earn more money by working hard, or we plan to build a beverage plant, or they remained lifelong friends and companions. 460 of those utterances that in fact also vary a little bit in terms of complexity. So that gives 3,405 words in total, of which almost 2,000 unique words, give and take a bit. Average word length 7.9 syllables, with quite a bit of variability in word length. I mentioned syntactic differences, but the bulk is really 84% simple statements. You've seen examples of it. Some of them are complex statements, roughly 10%. Flying standby can be practical if you want to save money. Is a bit more complex. There were simple questions in there also, and more complex questions, but the statements clearly outshine the questions in terms of their frequency. Huh? Okay, in the collection, we included about 22,000 speech sounds, all instances of the lingual speech sounds or involving the tongue as an active articulator. And here are the distributions of those in terms of both place and manner of articulation. And I would imagine that reflects sort of the general frequency of those manner and place categories in a, you know, a data collection of standard English. Plosives, most frequent, nasals, least frequent, and in terms of place, alveolars, most frequent, and palatals, hardly available in there. Okay, and those occurred in quite significant variety of contexts, yeah, often in clusters, but not always. So here, what you see on this particular graph is actually the preceding sound and the following sound adjacent. So, you know, often a consonantal context, but most often a vocalic context, some diphthongs, and of course, some silences at the end of the utterance specifically, in fact. So the consonantal contexts are often, but not always, consonant cluster kind of situations, depending on how you take into account syllable boundaries and so on and so on. Okay. So for native speakers of British English, in fact, we recorded 20 eventually, but I'm only able to report on 4 of them who had been fitted with such a standard palate. I think overall, I mean, looking at this now, it's easy to say for me, but I think the palates were quite good in terms of thickness. So the interference with articulation, I think, was minimal, although in 1 or 2 speakers, it did have an effect, I feel. So, but not in these ones, fortunately. And what did we do? We did the recordings of all these utterances, had them automatically segmented, had forced alignment applied to those utterances. We used mouse, in fact, the Munich segmentation system, which I still think, you know, does a fantastic job in automatic alignment here. But of course, since our ultimate aim is not only to look at spatial asymmetry, where it's probably less important to have the segmentation boundaries absolutely right, because we're looking at the middle of a sound anyway, a phone anyway, so you know you can afford at least a bit of variability there. We also want to look at temporal asymmetry. So for that purpose, we actually checked all the boundaries and adjusted them where necessary. And then, of course, it means adjusting all of them, actually all of them, yeah, to a bigger or smaller extent. And that's then the kind of file you end up with. Obviously, acoustics available. We've got the utterance labeling, but also the segmentation at word level, and as well as the segmentation at a phone level. And we always added a 3rd row for sort of comments like, is this a dark L or is it a clear L, for example, or do we find indications of creaky voice? in glottal stops, for example. So you know, that's what we had. And then, of course, for all of these utterances, EPG recordings with a 200 hertz frame rate. Okay, what did we find here? Inconsistent results with what we've done before. To cut a long story short, it's probably always the case like that, but that's good. I have nothing against that. In terms of the effect of manner of articulation, it's in fact only the approximants that in fact differ significantly from all the other sounds. So it's not so much the fricatives that we thought were very different in that respect. Here it's only the approximants. And in fact, it's particularly the lateral approximants there that cause this. Unilateral realization of lateral approximants rather than bilateral realization has a very strong effect on asymmetry in this particular case. And so that's definitely not consistent with what we found before. And in terms of place of articulation, we find greater variability in the alveolars and less variability in the velars. So the velars were less asymmetrical than the alveolars. That's consistent with Farnetani, in fact. And yeah, if you want to see a couple of prototypical palatograms in those speakers that really reflect this. And so that would be an alveolar plosive with, in fact, you know, 2 extra electrodes that were touched. So the difference is not very big. This is a prototypical fricative in those 4 speakers, and a prototypical velar, where it strikes me that there's still a lot of support here on the sides of the palate, in fact. Okay. And so I've commented on the fricatives. I would have liked this idea that speakers manipulate the speech channel in such a way to improve the perceptual characteristics of the fricatives, for example, to increase the turbulence of those fricatives. But the data here do not seem to support this, not in any strong fashion. And the approximants I've mentioned, the lateral approximants that are in fact often unilateral, and it would be good for us to look at this in far more detail. So what are the characteristics of those lateral approximants, and is there a difference between dark L's and clear L's? Syllable initially, syllable finally. You know, that's definitely something that we should look at. Alveolars, does it have something to do with the flexibility of the tongue? I mean, if you brace the tongue at the back in the velar area, you know, movements of the front of the tongue have probably a bigger effect than movements at the back of the tongue. That may play a role potentially in accounting for the asymmetries. So overall, it's a bit of a mixed bag, is the conclusion really. But what has puzzled me in all of this is that you know, handedness does not seem to play a consistent role, but and I haven't commented on this, but there's a bit of literature that has had a systematic look at lip opening. Also in the 1970s, 80s. The conclusion from that research seems to be that in the majority of speakers, in fact, there is bigger lip opening during articulation on the right-hand side than on the left-hand side. And that seems to apply to men and women, that seems to apply to different tasks that were used to elicit speech and so on. And I find that an interesting observation too, to combine that with what, with more left-sided asymmetry. It sort of seems to suggest, but this is speculation, of course, seems to suggest that speakers create a bigger obstruction on the left to direct the air channel towards the greater mouth opening as such, which would be relevant in many ways. So we should have done the experiment differently and do the recordings, the EPG recordings, simultaneous to filming lip opening to answer that particular question. So I can kick myself not having done this now. But in any case, we have a big set of EPG data that still have an awful lot of potential. And it's sort of a call for help, really, because that project, the data are there. There's still lots of work to be done in terms of segmentation and an analysis, not just in terms of asymmetries, but in terms of co-articulation. That's, I think, a gold mine in many ways, in terms of tongue-palate contact. So, yeah, that's probably a good point to conclude and to solicit questions. If you have any comments, would be very interested to hear. Thank you. Nicola.
Thank you for the interesting talk, and it's something I never really had thought about, this question of asymmetry. I was wondering whether you have also looked in your own data, I guess for the literature review, you don't have this info, on the acoustics, because I wonder whether there would be kind of a threshold from which there would be some noticeable differences acoustically, and could be something interesting also to look at. Honestly, I don't know which metric would be relevant to measure that, and I think probably you should also account for the overall degree of constriction and other factors, but it could be something to investigate from your data, because I think it's a very interesting database, and it'd be interesting, for instance, maybe to have some automatic classification from this to investigate whether it could be.
Yeah, it's. I think it's an excellent point that you make. Sort of suggested in some of these articles. Yeah, the acoustics. These asymmetries may serve an acoustic effect. What is the acoustic effect? Actually, looking at this would definitely be useful. And often the argument underlying is also a little bit for clinical purposes. So what is sort of the baseline situation? And so to what extent? And it looks like, the baseline situation is small in a way. And the asymmetries are not all that big, but that does not necessarily mean that